It is the 1st of October in the year 331 BC, and over the plain of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, lies a veil of dust so thick that it darkens the sun. The air tastes of dry sand and the metallic foreboding of blood, for here in this vast treeless wasteland, two worlds have gathered to settle the question of absolute dominion over Asia once and for all. On one side stands Alexander III of Macedon, a young man of only 25 years, whose name already echoes like thunder through the ancient world, and whose ambition knows no bounds save for the ocean at the end of the world. Opposite him stands Darius III, the King of Kings, the ruler of the massive Persian Empire, whose word is law from the coasts of the Aegean to the mountains of the Hindu Kush. It is the ultimate duel of David against Goliath, yet the dimensions exceed every imagination, for Alexander leads an army of around 47,000 battle-hardened veterans into the field, a deadly precision machine, while Darius has depopulated the Orient to annihilate this threat. Historians speak of a force that was between 200,000 and 1 million men, strong an army that fills the horizon, from one end to the other. The location of the battle Gaugamela, which translates to the House of the Camel, was chosen by Darius with care, as it is a wide, flat plain without hills and without rivers that Alexander could use as cover. The great king has left nothing to chance, and has even had the ground leveled in the days before the battle, removing shrubs and stones to create a perfect racetrack for his ultimate weapon. He relies on 200 terrifying scythed chariots, whose wheels are fitted with rotating blades designed to sever legs and bodies like stalks of wheat. Darius knows that he can only defeat Alexander in an open-pitched battle where his sheer mass will crush the Macedonian phalanx like a tidal wave. The night before the battle is marked by a psychological contrast that could hardly be deeper. In the Persian camp, nervous tension prevails, as Darius fears a nocturnal surprise attack and orders his men to remain awake in full armor all night long. They stand hour after hour in the darkness, staring into the black void and wearing themselves down with fear of what is to come. In the Macedonian camp, however, Alexander sleeps. He sleeps so deeply and soundly that his generals have to wake him in the morning. When his old general Parmenion asks him how he can sleep so calmly in the face of this overwhelming force, Alexander replies with an arrogance that seems almost divine, that the victory has already been won because the enemy has finally been brought to bay. Parmenion had advised him to attack in the night to compensate for the inferiority in numbers, but Alexander refused with the famous words, "I do not steal my victory." He intends to beat the god king in broad daylight before the eyes of the world, and without the stain of deceit. As the sun rises, the full extent of the threat is revealed, as the Persian front line stretches for almost 4 kilometers and outflanks the Macedonian line on both sides by far. Alexander stands with his elite companion cavalry on the right wing, while Parmenion commands the left wing, which has the task of holding the position and dying if necessary, while Alexander delivers the decisive blow. The Macedonian phalanx, the heart of the army, stands in the center, consisting of men armed with the sarissa, a pike over 5.5 meters in length. When they lower the lances, they form an impenetrable forest of points, against which no horse and no man can charge. But Alexander knows that he will be encircled if he remains stationary, so he does something unexpected. He begins to move his entire right wing to the far right, almost parallel to the front line. Darius watches this maneuver from his golden chariot in the center with concern. He fears that Alexander is attempting to leave the prepared ground on which his chariots are effective. To prevent this, Darius orders his cavalry on the left wing to cut off Alexander's path. The Persian front begins to stretch and shift, like dough being pulled apart, as thousands of Bactrian and Scythian horsemen storm toward Alexander's flank and engage the Macedonians in fierce fighting. The dust kicked up is so thick that the men can barely breathe, and the clashing of weapons is deafening. Now Darius sees his chance and unleashes his wonder weapon as the scythed chariots thunder toward the Macedonian center. One must imagine the sound when 200 four-horse chariots drum on the hard ground and the blades flash in the sun. It is an attack designed to spread pure terror. But the Macedonians are the most disciplined soldiers in the world. Instead of fleeing in panic, they execute a maneuver they call the Mousetrap. At a mere whistle, the ranks of the phalanx open, creating lanes in the formation. The chariot horses, which instinctively do not want to run into a wall of spears, steer themselves into these open lanes. Inside, however, wait the javelin throwers and the light infantry. The chariots race through the lanes and are cut down from the sides like fish in a barrel, and the dreaded weapon of the great king fizzles out ineffectively in the dust. Meanwhile, Alexander's movement to the right has caused a critical weakness in the Persian line. Since more and more Persian horsemen are trying to stop Alexander on the flank, a gap opens between the Persian left wing and the center where Darius stands. It is exactly the moment Alexander has waited for, like a chess player. He turns his companion cavalry abruptly 90 degrees and forms them into a giant wedge. At the tip of this wedge rides he himself. With a scream that is repeated 1,000 times by his men, this wedge stabs directly into the open wound of the Persian front. It is the decisive moment of antiquity, as Alexander ignores all other skirmishes and rides frontally at the chariot of the great king. The Macedonian infantry follows him at a run with their long sarissas pointed forward, and they push the Persian guard aside. The fight now becomes personal. The sources report that Alexander came so close to Darius that he could see the terror in the eyes of the god king. Darius sees his bodyguard collapsing under the onslaught of the Macedonian horsemen, while javelins fly around his head, and his charioteer is struck by a spear and falls dead to the ground. In this moment, the courage of the ruler of the world breaks. He believes himself lost. Darius turns his heavy chariot and flees. The flight of the king is the signal for the collapse. As the Persian soldiers in the center see that their divine leader is leaving the field, they throw away their weapons and run for their lives. Yet the battle is not yet won. While Alexander triumphs in the center, a catastrophe is playing out on the Macedonian left wing. Parmenion is being almost crushed by the massive superiority of the Persian cavalry under the command of the brilliant General Mazaeus. The Macedonians here are on the brink of annihilation, and messengers ride in wild haste to Alexander to plead for help. Alexander faces the hardest decision of his life. Should he pursue Darius and end the war with one stroke by cutting off the head of the snake? Or should he turn back and save his army from destruction, but risk the enemy escaping? Alexander decides for his men. He breaks off the pursuit and turns his horsemen against the troops of Mazaeus. It comes to arguably the hardest and bloodiest fighting of the entire day, as the exhausted companions meet the still fresh Persian armored cavalry. It is a slaughter without mercy, but when the Persians notice that their king has fled, their fighting spirit is extinguished as well. They attempt to disengage, and are slain by the thousands during the rout. The plain of Gaugamela transforms into a vast graveyard. The ancient sources exaggerate the numbers of the dead immensely, but it is certain that tens of thousands of Persians lost their lives, while the losses of the Macedonians were astonishingly low, perhaps only a few hundred or 1,000 men, which underscores the efficiency of their warfare. As the dust settles in the evening, the world has changed irrevocably. Alexander has not only won a battle, he has beheaded an empire. Darius flees into the mountains of Media, a king without a country, and without an army, pursued by his own satraps, who will eventually betray and murder him before Alexander can reach him. Alexander has himself proclaimed King of Asia, the gates of the richest cities in the world, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, open to him. The loot he captures is so immense that it will destabilize the economy of the Mediterranean for generations through the sheer amount of gold that suddenly comes into circulation. Yet the victory of Gaugamela is more than just a military triumph. It marks the beginning of a new era known as Hellenism. Greek culture, language, and architecture spread to the banks of the Indus. Greek philosophers discuss with Indian gymnosophists, and Buddha statues begin to wear togas. It is the first globalization of history, a fusion of West and East that would never have taken place without this day in October 331. But Gaugamela also carries the seed of tragedy within it. The immeasurable success changes Alexander. The young king, who once slept in the dirt with his soldiers, begins to dress like a Persian god-king and demands of his free Macedonian companions that they throw themselves on the ground before him. The victory over the external enemy leads to internal decay. The men who bled for him at Gaugamela will years later in India refuse their allegiance and force him to turn back. When we look at the battlefield of Gaugamela today, we see only dust and empty vastness. There are no great monuments there, only the silence of the desert. But in this silence, the echo of the thunderous hoofbeats still resonates. It is the story of a man who refused to accept what is possible and what is impossible. Alexander saw a gap in a wall of men, and he had the courage to thrust through it. Gaugamela remains the masterpiece of military leadership, the proof that precision beats mass, and that the will of a single individual can determine the fate of millions. It was the day the old Orient died, and a new world was born in bloodfire and the blinding light of the Macedonian sun.